Hi, friends. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today is October 16th, 2019, and we're joined here by Mr. Joe Merlino, who is going to be presenting on reclaiming stewardship. My name is Melissa Rao. I'm the Senior Program Director for Leadership at ECF, and we're happy that we can be bringing this to you today. Just a bit of housekeeping stuff. As you know, we're bringing this from a Zoom webinar, and there's a chat box, and so we will be taking a few pauses throughout. There will be a Q&A answer section at the end of the presentation. But if you feel like you've been inspired by something you heard, or you want some clarity, or want to ask a question throughout the webinar, feel free to just tap in the chat box, and I will field those questions throughout. Now, without further ado, Joe Merlino, if you want to go to the next page, the next slide, Joe. Okay. Joe is a good friend of mine. He is an ECF a capital campaign consultant. I've known him for about a year and a half or so, maybe a year, maybe less than, I don't know, I forget. But it's been fun working with Joe and knowing his heart for excellence in the church. He comes from a background of consulting. He had a long career in executive and leadership roles for the for-profit business sector, and all of those things he's been able to apply in the church setting. And so we're grateful for your time, Joe. We're grateful for you being with us, and we're looking forward to the wisdom you have to share.
My pleasure. Is that my cue?
That's your cue. It's all you, bud.
All right. So let's just thank you, Melissa, and thank you everybody for joining us today. If you're on the West Coast, good morning. If you're in Mountain Time and in Albuquerque, the way Kirsten and Melissa and I are, then good afternoon, as well as all our friends in the Central and Eastern time zones. So I'm going to stay on my slide a little bit because kind of helps to know a little more about me. And I am an ECF capital campaign consultant. I've been in that work for a little less than a year and a half. And I can apply my skills in the business world to that work, which is really mission-driven work, which feeds my soul. And I guess as we get older, we become more intentional, which is a good thing. And I've been an Episcopalian, having grown up Roman Catholic, since 2009. And from the moment I got involved in my own home parish here in Albuquerque, which is St. Michael and All Angels, I immediately got involved in congregational development and ministry renewal work, which then led me to vestry governance. My focus has always been year-round stewardship planning, not just annual giving, but looking at a more holistic approach. So we're going to go through that today. And I was so inspired by my understanding for my long search of the meaning of faith and how we could take words like Christian discipleship and Christian commitments and sacrifice and stewardship. And I found new meaning in the Episcopal tradition that I felt that I was called to the diaconate. And even though I was not called to holy orders, I was called to go to seminary. So I kind of almost shut down my consulting and coaching practice that I've had since 2004 and went to the Episcopal Seminary of the West, which is Church Divinity School of the Pacific, and got an MA in practical theology. So everything that I like to do in my world is to convert theory into practical application, or theology into good theological practice or spiritual practice. So that falls into stewardship and mission integration. And the primary things that we're going to talk today about are really relational communities and how to build a relational community and what the practical impact is on fundraising, but specifically in terms of this season in today's conversation, annual giving. So we know there's a lot of trepidation, sometimes uncertainty about how much money we're going to raise. We know the elephant in the room is we're a community of faith, but we've got to deal with this money thing, right? Which makes us uncomfortable. And I would contend, even if you weren't a person of faith, you might get a little antsy about being asked to have money donated to a foundation or a nonprofit organization. So the conundrum we find ourselves in is, how do we take something like finances and money, or something that's very logically driven, that's purely transactional, and convert it into a transformational experience, which is an experience of the heart, right? Which aligns itself beautifully with faith. And so how can we shift that focus from finances to a heart-centered experience? And the simple answer is that they're not diametrically opposed, they're actually siblings. practically twins. I mean, we put them in conversation and we put them back in relationship. And we have to acknowledge the fact that so many of our churches and institutions, and I'm going to use the word institutions throughout this because we have Episcopal seminaries and independent assisted living facilities, and we have dioceses and cathedrals and non-church entities. ECF is an Episcopal entity. And so if we're in a brick and mortar facility, it mandates that we have to have funds to turn the lights on, to deal with annual operating expenses and repairs and expansions, and to employ staff, the brain power and that time and talent to actually drive mission through ministry. But the other side of the coin is, as people of faith, we have a Christian commitment or responsibility to cultivate our own heart, but also to tend to the hearts or care of the soul of those others within our church or faith community and those outside of it, and to tend to their needs. And so in that context, that practice allows us to further our own understanding of the meaning of faith and its implications in our lives, as well as what effect our practice has on the lives of others and how they come to then experience faith. So let's move on a little bit. So the goal then is, when we put heart and mind in conversation, the goal is to have a seamless integration where they're comfortable with one another, which means we're comfortable with both of them. And so when we achieve integrated hearts and minds, when we engage one another with the intention of knowing one another intimately, that's the relational component. And so when we make deep connections, and I'm sure many of you on this webinar have experienced this in some capacity, or maybe in many times, where those deep connections and aha moments with another person lead to a self-awareness, but then also an awareness of them, which creates deeper bonds. Right? So we're really talking about faith experience. And so deep connections that allow us to understand and experience faith and its practical meaning in our lives are really paramount. But within the context of how do they express and actually help us understand our experience of God, and how our experience of God as people of faith influences the relationships we have with other people. And then just as importantly, especially in annual giving, but in any capacity of financial stewardship and fundraising, is how does our parish actually nurture that experience? Because if you think about it, there's, I don't know, at least a dozen, probably 18 Episcopal parishes in the greater Albuquerque area. I could go to any one of those. In fact, we have a concordance with the Lutherans, and we actually had an assistant rector for about 5 years, even through our interim, which happened about 5 years ago. And if it wasn't for our Lutheran assistant, we probably would have a difficult time getting through our interim process. So I could have followed her when she got her pastorship literally 2 miles from my Episcopal parish, St. Michael and All Angels. So what I've always found, being an active member of my stewardship committee and chairing it as well, is that these conversations that are more intentional allow us to understand why people are where they are. You know, at ECF, especially in campaigns, capital campaigns, we talk a lot about, you know, what keeps you coming back to your parish, right? And that's a good question. And sometimes those answers can be quite cursory or kind of knee-jerk reactions or responses. What we want to do is we want to go a little deeper. And so what's our agenda or our path today? And I purposely put a labyrinth on the left-hand side of your screen because sometimes the path isn't always clear or it's circuitous. But in this case, this will be a fairly linear process. But faith being what it is, things don't always happen as intended, or kind of God has his/her own plan for how we kind of walk forward in faith and create our own sense of what the meaning of faith is in our lives. So here's how we're going to proceed. Our goal is to take financial obligation and move it into joyful giving. What we're going to do is explore the definitions of transactional and transformational as a foundation. In that context, I want us to kind of revisit and reflect on our own understanding and practice of stewardship individually and how that might express itself in your parish. And then I want to revisit the ethos or theology or biblical revelation, if you will, of stewardship. Get us back to our spiritual foundation, kind of shift our perception into maybe more of a religious framework and reality, and then offer a new framework for stewardship that reflects that theology. And then I'm going to give you some practical examples or share some practices that I've used in annual giving, introduced in capital campaigns at my time with ECF, that'll allow you to kind of develop and live into that understanding. Okay. Now remember, if anybody has any questions whatsoever, type into your chat box and Melissa will stop me and we'll answer your questions. So we have a Q&A at the end of this, but I think it's always helpful, and whether we were doing this in a workshop or whether we're doing this in a webinar, it's always good to be able to entertain questions throughout. So let's look at transactional and transformational. And I purposely use the conjunction "and" to kind of reinforce the fact that they're not in a sibling rivalry. They're actually in a healthy sibling relationship. So transactionally speaking, it's the exchange of something of value, or at least of perceived value, such as goods and services, maybe even ideas and points of view, or funds between two or more parties that rely more on the logical benefits of the transaction or the event. They're done to meet a specific need at a specific time for a specific reason. They don't take a lot of thought. They're more functional. You know, when I go to my insurance agent and I want to cover my car to reduce myself from any excessive financial liability and expenditures because I want to be covered by insurance, I'm not really thinking of that as a transformational event. It's how much do I have to pay? What's the coverage? Is it as good as what I have now? Might it even be a little bit cheaper? And I'm happy. Okay. So it's just to give you an example. These happen throughout our life and they make perfect sense. So just like going to the grocery store. The point is that they're logical, they're intended to actually meet a specific need. They're cursory, so they don't take a lot of thought, and they're really more surface level. And conversations work the same way. So I'll give you an example. If I were to ask somebody what their experience of God was in their parish, they might say to me, I just really love fellowship. And I like the fact that we get together and we do things during the week and on the weekend. And that's just, I like that. And that's a standard response. It's a good response. But it also helps us to understand why is that important to them? How does that touch them? Why is fellowship so important in their life? What are the core motivations or needs they're trying to satisfy through fellowship? And we're going to get to that a little bit later. But when you look at transactional events, they have very little impact in the way we change our thinking and our behavior. But a transformational experience is an entirely different thing, because an exchange between two people, it could be multiple parties, but let's just look at it as a one-on-one relationship or conversation that evokes a meaningful experiential response that orients or even reorients each party to a new way of thinking, an entirely different way of being, which is really the journey of faith, if you think about it. So conversations are relational. They're more emotional, experiential, they're deeper. So when I say to someone, why is fellowship so important to you? Or how do you feel in that moment of fellowship? That moves from a level one kind of superficial level into a more substantive conversation. Okay? So transformational experiences in view or actually orient us in a way that changes our behavior. And it's also mutually informative for both parties and also mutually beneficial. So as we move forward from this relationship between transactional and transformational, I want us to think a little more about stewardship. And so I'm going to borrow something from the Reverend Richard Cunningham, who is still alive, but quite old, and who is of the Baptist tradition, who's a theologian, an educator, and also a preacher and minister. And so I found his work back in 2009, and he wrote a book called Creative Stewardship, which really has more of a holistic relational approach to stewardship. So at the end of this, if you choose to download the slide deck, you'll see all the additional readings based on the people that I quote in the slide deck. So the question is fairly simple. So what's in a word? How do you perceive it? How do you think about it? How do you react to it? How do you practice it? And oftentimes, or sometimes, it's more than we actually know. Kind of requires some unpacking about the definition of the word. And is there more substance to the word? Maybe its original meaning. And so there is a person who lives in a secular world by the name of Joseph Jaworski, who wrote a book called Synchronicity. He is well known in secular leadership, organizational leadership, and development. And this is a quick quote from him. And it's through language that we describe the world. And when we describe it, we create distinctions that govern our actions. So to put it another way, we do not describe the world we see the world we describe. And so it is with stewardship.
Joe, quick question for you then. Somebody asked a question about baggage. The baggage that we bring to the table when we think about money and fundraising in the church context. And so I'm just curious if you had any insight or words of wisdom that you might share with the group.
Well, the words of wisdom and the insights, I'm hoping become apparent as we go through our webinar. Because we all have experiences in life, and a lot of them negative experiences that really influence our willingness to even change our way of thinking. And so that I know in my own parish in Albuquerque, and even when we work on capital campaigns, that, you know, the money piece carries a tremendous amount of baggage. But I do know from my own work at ECF and in my own parish, and even with secular nonprofit entities, that the ability to get people to shift their thinking normally comes from positive experiences, not from a logical reframing of stewardship. So I could tell you all day how stewardship is really holistic, and it's part of our biblical revelation, and it's all part of what we're supposed to be doing as Christian disciples. And I could beat you over the head with that. And if I was a priest, I could preach on that every Sunday. But at some point, it may not really fully sink in until we have an intentional conversation that almost be pastoral in nature, that allows us to really just relax into it, and for you to maybe witness it and experience it from me or your conversation partner. Does that help?
Perfect.
Okay, so the problem with stewardship, just like so many other religious words, is that it's prevalent in our vocabulary, but we can't necessarily release our baggage and embrace it. And the interesting thing is, when you talk about baggage, despite our familiarity as people of faith, I've found that, you know, lay and clergy leadership, even in seminaries of all places, we often equate stewardship with the asking for, the giving of, and the receiving of money, which I've always found interesting and also fundraising. So, or I should say frustrating. So, and then it gets exacerbated because we limit this care of the souls, the care of creation, into a money proposition. But then we also limit that into what we typically call annual giving, right? Or we call it our annual stewardship campaign. But really, stewardship is about occasional giving, which you can relate to special projects or programs that don't happen every year but crop up during the year. Major gifts, which a lot of times can fall into capital campaigns and planned giving. They're part of the holistic framework of stewardship in the context of financial stewardship. So here's what I'd like you to do. I'm always a big fan of having people take a test drive about the things that I share with them. So I don't believe in top-down approaches. I believe in bottom-up, and I believe in people having an opportunity to take the recommendations that I make and try them out for themselves and see where they land. So you've got now all the way through Sunday afternoon. So make sure you go to church on Sunday. And I want you to just ask some folks, even if it's clergy, what do you think of when you think of the word stewardship? And, or you could say, how do you define stewardship? And then on the back end is, how do you practice stewardship? Because more often than not, if you think about stewardship as money, when it comes time to practicing, it's coming up to me on a Sunday at my stewardship table in my parish and saying, oh, it's pledge season. Notice I said pledge season. I guess you want to pledge. Do you have a pledge card? How much did I pledge last year? Oh, by the way, do I need to sign something again so you can do a direct withdrawal from my bank account? Or what about my IRA mandatory distribution since I'm over 70? That's transactional, okay? So, but if you're thinking more transformationally, and we have a conversation about our ministry, and since all ministry is a reflection of the purity and truth of stewardship, then that's a different proposition, right? So let's move on a little more. There's also another way that we talk about stewardship, which is quite common in most faith traditions, and that is it's time, treasure, and talent. And the first thing I have to say is they're absolutely critical, every one of them. So it's the volunteer hours that we generously contribute and support a church ministry so that we can engage mission in the world, skills and talents that make ministries more impactful, and then the financial resources that fund, sustain, and actually enable ministries to thrive. I mean, again, there is a relationship between all three, and it's in equal measure. So the one thing that's really important is that we acknowledge the fact that all three are important and that each is critical to a specific or each individual parishioner's vitality, their experience of the church and faith, their sense of personal mission, not just communal mission, and also spiritual fulfillment. So a lot of times in church, I think we tend to think so much about community, and mission is community, and ministry is community. And we tend to focus more on outreach beyond the walls of the parish. And sometimes we forget about inside the walls of the parish, and that's its pastoral care. But there's always that individual piece. So individuals' ability to connect with faith and to think of their lives as missional and even personal or professional ministry, if they're still working the way I am, is an entirely different conversation. I use the image of the tree here because I'm sure some of you might have done budget narratives or funding trees, and where you spend most of your money in the church might be the thicker part of the trunk, and you move into thicker branches, and it kind of gives people a visual to complement a budget narrative about where our money goes. And you usually find out that the vast majority of your money goes to keeping the building operating and staffing the folks that work in it, right? There's a flip side to that. You can do a funding tree too, where you're actually looking at your ministries and how much time. Just ask your committee chair to do their best guess of how much time is spent during the year. And I've always found that that's a real beautiful and eye-awakening balance for parishioners to really understand that their contributions are so valuable and how many hours go into specific ministry. Whether it's homelessness, the food bank, whether it's, Eucharistic ministers, immigration, senior ministry, whatever it might be. So let's take a visit back to stewardship theology. So I'm going to quote the Reverends Thomas Carson and Ronald Reed. They wrote a pretty quick read, about 29 pages, but very impactful. They used to work for the Worldwide Church in Manhattan, and they wrote a book in 1986 called Year-Round Stewardship Planning, Mission and Ministry. And so the Reverends, I pulled this quote from early on in the first chapter, and it's our vocation to be stewards is the very heart of the biblical revelation, which acknowledges God as the gracious giver of all things. We know that. We've heard that so many times. And our task as the church, or as people of the church, is to become fully what God has already made us to be, and that's namely givers like God. Right? Our Creator wants us to create. Right? The ultimate giver has made us to give. And this is one of the most profound truths about ourselves. And it requires that we will relinquish kind of self-gratification for a care of others, for selflessness. Really tough to do, but it's always good to be reminded. But essentially, our call is to be in relationship. And so, again, as written in the Reclaiming Stewardship advertisement, It's expressed in the care of the soul of the other, in those living things with whom we share the planet, and the precious resources we have been given that are here to sustain and inspire us. And yes, there's an environmental component to it, right? There is a dedication and responsibility to keep living things safe so that they can thrive as well. And we know that's an issue, and it continues despite what administration currently has the majority in Congress or in the presidency or whatever. It never leaves us. But where we want to focus today is really on personal relationships, and that's where we're going to go back to Richard Cunningham. And so for our purposes, we'll focus on our call to care for the soul of others, which my hope is that what you can glean from today and start experimenting with some of this, you might see that have an impact in the lives of those you talk to enough so that some of that stewardship baggage starts to dissipate. You'll be absolutely blessed if it's an epiphany and all of a sudden somebody lets that go. More than likely it takes time, because in some ways we're asking people to change and try something new or be receptive to something new they haven't really experienced before, or at least on a consistent basis. So let's quote the Reverend Cunningham. The great commandment is to love God and to love our neighbor as ourselves. So that's Luke 10:27. But if the central purpose of creation and redemption is person-making, which is our formation, and personal relationships, then nothing is more important in Christian stewardship than what happens in our personal relationships. It's a proving ground. It's a sandbox to play. It's a sandbox to learn. And we can't help but to be in relationship. So persons are our richest resource, the richest resource of our lives. And he continues. So our responsibility is most intent in social groups or groups in which we have sustained relationships, face-to-face contact, and common interests. And these groups may take shape at work, in social life, in the neighborhood, and certainly in the church. So it's in these close relationships that we learn how to open ourselves to others, to love and serve our neighbors, to forgive and be forgiven, and to help and be helped. I'd also say it's also a place where we learn how to be loved, right? With all our flaws and all our inconsistencies and, the very humanness of who we are. That's probably the great ordeal. And so in that learning, in that formative aspect of relationships that has tremendous potential and opportunities for growth, there's a mutual ministry within the church that facilitates the growth of people towards personhood or personal and spiritual maturity, and that enables their ministry in the world. It's almost understanding mission, acting in ministry, and a broader understanding of how we connect more deeply as individuals, communally or in solidarity, to really live out our Christian faith. So in continuing with the practice of relational stewardship, it's in personal relationships that we actually are formed and transformed. And you'll see that as I give you some examples very shortly about kind of questions to ask, you'll see that it requires reflection and discernment as well. So again, there's more of a holistic relationship in this process of reflection, discernment, formation, and ultimately transformation that applies to all aspects of stewardship, even the financial side. So the one thing I want to share is that the benefits of living a life of faith become clearer when the meaning of faith and an appreciation for one's parish or religious institution becomes more relevant in the lives of that individual, that parishioner, right? That member of a congregation. It's important to know that their financial expression or financial gift or commitment is typically directly correlates to that appreciation, right? That appreciation, that understanding of the meaning of faith, and especially with respect to how the congregation nurtures that experience. So how are we going to practice this? Because right now we've been playing in the world of concept. Well, we've got to invite parishioners to be an active part of an annual giving process, right? So my friend Charles Fisher knows this because he's a capital campaign consultant. And this is a big part of our approach. We invite parishioners to engage, right, usually in conversations. And what I'm going to share with you here doesn't necessarily have to be conversational from a reflective standpoint, but is really served when conversation becomes a major part of the process. So we invite parishioners to become an active part of our annual giving process outside of the act of making a pledge. That's the elephant in the room. Everybody knows that's where we're going, right? That's what we need. So logically, they understand it. But then we really need to offer structured opportunities where parishioners can reflect on the practical meaning of faith and its impact so that they can come to their own deeper understanding of their faith experience. The key here is don't make any assumptions. So one of the questions I have for you is, how many times have you been in a parish and you're in a pew, engaged in worship, and you're seeing somebody in a choir smiling and singing? You're seeing altar servers, chalice bearers, people read, and they're in the moment, and they're filled with gratitude, and they seem content, and everything seems to be going well. But when you finally talk to them at coffee hour, there's definitely bumps in the road in their life. They're not quite as happy as they seem when they're on the altar. And the bottom line is they have things going on. And so we tend to make too many assumptions about people and where they are in their lives and how well things are going, right? Now, I'm not saying we're having a pastoral intervention, right? I'm just saying be aware of that, because everyone is motivated by specific needs, tangible and intangible, that drive how they think and how they behave. And not everybody shares those. In fact, it's rare, right, for someone to come up to you and say, hey, Melissa, tell me about the core motivations that you have that drive your behavior. It doesn't really happen, does it? No. You have to look for cues in conversations. We also want to make it easy for parishioners to engage in the process. So one of the ways we make this intentional is to ask questions that require deep reflection. Now, that same question that I kind of played with Melissa on is the same thing that applies to these 4 questions. And I'm using these same questions right now in stewardship in my own parish. And just to give you a framework, my parish has an average Sunday attendance of usually 295, sometimes 300. We have 3 services on a Sunday. And for those of you that are interested in the number of pledging units or households in the parish, it's around 360. And we know that that may be considered large for an Episcopal parish. And the thing that I want you to know is you can have a congregation of 70 people, and this process still works really well because we're dealing with individuals. It has nothing to do with the size of the congregation. It has everything to do with the experience of parishioners, congregants, etc. So the first question would be, how do you experience God in your life? I don't think it's a question that most people are asked. How does your experience of God influence your relationships? And I know you're reflecting on these personally as I deliver these to you. In what ways does your parish nurture those experiences? And then, given your experience of God, how do you find hope in the world? Now, you don't need to use these. And I've been working with reflective reflections in my own parish for the last 3 years. And we've kind of cultivated and nurtured this process with parishioners over time. And this year we're moving 100% into that experience and not relying so much on where our money goes, right? And how we fund things in the parish and, how impactful our ministries are. Because over the last 2 years, it's become pretty evident of how we do that. And we never let that go, but this year is the experiential year of how we walk into it. And again, I would challenge you, if I said, let's pick out 5 people in your congregation, do you really know what their experience of God is in their life? What the impact is? How they walk in the world, see people differently? How maybe in the last 6 months or a year or 10 years, they've actually radically change the way they view people, even if it's the barista at Starbucks? How do they engage that person? Or the homeless person that they drive by or walk by, right? Or they see at the intersection, right? Or the person that they've been sharing a pew with for the last 5 years. And have we ever really thought about how the parish really nurtures that? We know the parish engages in ministry, and most of us relate our parish experience through how we engage in ministry. And then the whole question is a question, again, that really isn't administration dependent. It's really just how we experience hope. Well, you've gone through a major divorce or a bankruptcy or whatever, you know, a death in your family, a death of a spouse, etc. So in my own parish, we actually did videos this year. And I actually conducted the interviews, and I sat with 16 people. Some were coupled, some were teenagers, some were as old as 80, 85. They represented the demographic of the parish. And I missed all 3 services on August 18th and August 25th. But I could tell you, I had 16 worship services in those 2 weeks that I went to in 20 to 30 minute congregations. 20 to 30 minute congregations with those parishioners. And I'm sorry, I'm getting a little choked up. So, because the conversations were so deep, and they were even deep for the 2 brothers who are in our J2A program, who are 15 and 17. And just in their experience of a church. So, and every week now we've edited those, and we actually have a 3.5 to 4 minute video clip that runs right after the sermon, where we can hear people that are representative of the congregation actually share their experience in each question. So we do 1 question a week, and then we give them a minute reflection. And so I'll share a little bit about how I can leverage that post worship and on a Sunday and throughout the week. Okay. Now, before I talked about cursory responses, and somebody's going to give you a knee-jerk response like fellowship or I love worship, something like that, right? But then a response or a question that you could apply would be fairly simple, which, why is that important? And how does it make you feel? So I mentioned that earlier. It's just an opportunity to go a little bit deeper, because that's where the substance lies. Nobody's expecting you to engage in pastoral care. Nobody's expecting you to be a licensed psychotherapist, whether you've got a master's or a PhD. It's not about that. It's just how to prime the pump a little bit to get people to open up and enjoy the experience of being able to share and have you witness that and maybe share in return. Okay? So that's a simple framework. Let me jump back. That's a real simple framework. It doesn't require, it's not a capital campaign. It doesn't have 3 phases. It doesn't take a year to a year and a half, right? It can be a 5 or 6 or 7 week part of a campaign. And my goal was to really introduce you to a different way of thinking and experimenting, even playing with your relationship with stewardship without giving you the functional blocking and tackling of how we do that. I mean, we've got Project Resource, the annual giving seminar and Project Resource, or even materials online you can download. My friend Sarah Leach, who does capital campaigns like Charles and I, also actually delivers those workshops and has written on them. So there's enough in Vital Practices and the vestry papers on that help you with how to frame your annual experience or annual campaign. My goal is to make it more experiential. But once we have that experience, how do we really, well, let me put it this way. How do we really make it easy for people to experience those types of reflections and then share? Well, the easiest way to do it is to make it part of worship. You might have a reflection of the week. You might have a handout with a short narrative, has the question and then the narrative. It could be in your bulletin, supplemental to the bulletin that you give people when they walk in. That's an usher responsibility. And then you want to allocate time for reflection during the service, like I described. The preacher of the week might want to incorporate some aspect of it or part of it in the day's sermon. I've been to enough services outside of my own parish where I see that happen on a more consistent basis. Of course, some of the functional stuff is you may want to have a theme. You might want to have someone design a logo. And if you've got a pretty creative and active liturgical arts committee, you might have, banners and beautiful things within the nave and maybe the narthex or vestibule that reinforce it, that make it, again, more of a holistic experience. So it's not just coming from the altar. And also you have the option to make it, a video or multimedia production, complemented by, posting it on the web. So there's a variety of things you can do. And if we were in an actual workshop, we'd break out into small groups. We kind of talk about your own parish's experience, things that you've tried, things you want to try, and then we'd map out what might work, right? Well before you actually move into annual giving. So we're trying to play a little catch up today, okay? So my goal is just to lay out a simple framework, knowing it takes a little bit more work and thinking. But once people have experienced the reflection and had a chance to think, what do we do after worship? So it's really easy to have a stewardship Q&A table. And if you've got a theme and a logo, you can create a little banner and kind of put it on front of a table and just be available to have conversations with parishioners as they exit the nave into a narthex to talk to maybe the rector, maybe the preacher on their way out, the reception line, so to speak. It's inevitable when I'm in this position for people to come up and want a pledge card, as I kind of shared with you before, I role played a little bit. But I satisfy that need for them, but I always ask them, what did you think of today's reflection? And how did it impact you? Were you able to connect with it in some way? And what was that way? I've never had anybody dismiss the question. I've never had anyone really get kind of agitated. The worst response I've ever gotten was somebody who said, I'm not quite certain. I really need to think about it. And I said, well, will you let me know next week? And the response was, yes. Okay. So you have the opportunity, if you're present somewhere in a vestibule or narthex, rather than the parish hall. So when you get them right after the service, to have conversations. And on your table, you might have your stewardship letter, and you might have an explanation of the reflection process with questions, etc. You may have a formation hour where the questions presented again and people share their own experience. Of course, you want to incorporate it in godly play and youth formation, again, so we have solidarity in the congregation. And you might have services throughout the week, whether it's morning prayer or whether it's an evening service on a Wednesday night or maybe a Saturday family service, and you might have formation throughout the week. So you might want to just touch on it a little bit. And then if you've got ministry meetings throughout the week, you might want to incorporate these questions within the context of an opening prayer or an invocation before you have a stewardship meeting. So the goal is to have multiple ways of keeping this alive over annual giving. And as more and more people get involved in the process, they can become open to it. And the more they become open to it, the more likely they are to leave some of that baggage behind. Okay? So we're getting really close where I'm going to get the hands from Melissa. Yeah. So the jazz hands. So the one thing I want to focus on are some interesting things, some that seem paradoxical. We want to focus on the person, on the individual, even though we typically focus on the community in terms of our mission and ministry. And we want that focus, that person-centered approach to be experiential. We want it to be heart-centered. Right? There's no manipulation in here. We are people of faith. This is where we live, in the heart. And so we honor that what is most important to members of our faith community based on the motivations and life experiences that they've had that influence their thinking and behavior, because every one of us is unique. There's no top-down approach here. There's no one-size-fits-all. And so we promote reflection that moves from an awareness of self then into a greater awareness of my relationship with all those people that are around me. There's the communal connection. There's the beginning of solidarity, right? And we know that the work is cross-generational. But the key part for formation is that we walk in faith. Like we trust that people are seeking a deeper relationship with the Trinity, for a reason that, again, is very personal to them. We trust that they're hungry for opportunities to reflect and grow spiritually. We trust that living into the paradoxical nature of faith, which is the tough part, that if we engage in this process, that we will be rewarded with financial commitments that are commensurate with people's maybe newfound or more enlightened experience of faith, because they've been asked to be part of the reflective process. And that we trust that the practice of relational stewardship will evoke shared experience or solidarity that will create binding connections, deep binding connections that impact congregational vitality and ministry development and renewal. So we focus on stewardship as a relational way of being with one another, of learning about one another. And we know that it will have impacts financially, but we also know there's this beauty of affecting the vitality of the congregation in our ministries. So I want to know if there's any questions about everything that I just shared with you in the last 40 to 45 minutes.
I mean, so many questions. I have questions. And what I would like to encourage folks to do is remember that there's a chat box in the bottom of your ribbon that you can just double click on the chat box and type in your question there, and we'll be able to field that for you. But I was reflecting, Joe, what motivated people to dial in today, to listen to your webinar? And I started thinking about maybe some reasons why. A lot of stewardship is down in their churches and whatnot, and I can't help but wonder if you have any insight for us about kind of the discipleship factor. Obviously, stewardship is a piece of discipleship. So in what ways might you suggest that churches take their stewardship practice and make it beyond a campaign or beyond the fall, throughout the whole year? I'm just curious what you might say about that.
Yeah, there's a couple aspects of that. So if you look at financial stewardship, I brought the slide up where we talked about annual giving and occasional giving and capital campaigns, major groups, etc. So there's that more holistic approach to financial stewardship, addressing all those areas of needs. That in itself takes you out of annual and makes it year round. Okay. The second component is that I know in my experience, even when I was an Episcopalian, that we don't really think of ministry as the practice of stewardship, typically, because we've been so conditioned to think of it as about money. And so I know when I have conversations, with clergy, and again, I'll reference my own experience here in Albuquerque, and I talk to people outside of my parish rectors, which I've gotten to know over the years I've been here. But even when you have a formation hour, if we do a lot on immigration here in New Mexico, just like they do in Arizona and in Texas and Southern California, it's important to us, right? It's an immediate need. And so if we were to invite someone in to speak about immigration, which we have in the past, and track the migration from Central America, through the beast, the train that takes them through Mexico to get them to the border of the US, if I was introducing that person, I would say, Joe Merlino's here to talk about this migration and the plight of immigrants in Central America and their migration through Mexico. And, in the context of who we are as a congregation, we are caretakers and stewards, and responsible for taking care of those around us outside of the parish community. Just to frame stewardship in that context before someone speaks at an event. If you do that enough, it actually gets through to people and it becomes more a part of how they view stewardship. Does that help?
It does. It's great. I do have a few comments. There are some questions about this slide deck being available. Friends, actually, this has been recorded. This entire webinar has been recorded. So in addition to the recording, you will also receive a PDF version of the slide deck. This will also live on our Vital Practices website, which you can get to by visiting www.ecfvp.org. And so it'll also be in archives there as well. So if you lose it, you forget to download it, etc., you can always visit us on there to also grab that. So just wanted to give you the heads up there. What other questions or comments might folks have, that while you have Joe Merlino, who is also a consultant, maybe you have some questions about your specific context. If you would like to ask any questions, if they're not too personal, you don't mind sharing them, feel free to type them in your chat box. I'm just curious, Joe, about a little bit more about the year-round stewardship. I loved your idea about the video, and I'm curious about what type of technology you needed or you used in order to capture some of those folks' stories.
Actually, we have a videography source. So we have someone that's worked with a parish before.
Great.
So when we were in a rector search, and as recently as about a year and a half ago, when we did a video on our immigration initiative, where we work with other parishes in the greater Albuquerque area, which it's a very ecumenical ministry, which in itself is really exciting. So, and it also incorporates our diocesan retreat center as well. So it was really easy for us to kind of move into that source. So all we really did was, I had the questions, and we looked at, this is the typical kind of functional stuff you would do. You say, well, we want to have at least 10 interviews, and so let's identify 20 people that are representative of the congregation. We have a very multi-generational congregation. And so I call those people personally, let them know what we were doing. Are you comfortable with doing this? Because you're going to be on the big screen during worship service. And I know if it were me, I would bolt to the men's room for that minute and a half that I might be up there. Because even though I do public speaking, I don't like to hear myself or see myself on video.
So you won't be watching this recording?
Exactly. And that was a way for me also to share. That's absolutely true. So, and that was a way for me to make sure that they were on board, but to also let them know what the questions would be, do a follow-up email where I confirm the time. We did them in our parish offices. We used different settings in the parish office. And so the toughest part was actually scheduling people on a Sunday so they could still go to their worship service, but also do the video interview. And so they were back-to-back weekends, and we actually interviewed, I would say 16 folks, but it was 11 interviews. And then the editing is really important. So I worked with the editor very, very closely. So you need to make it engaging. If you just had Joe Merlino talking for 3 minutes about his experience, there's going to be spots in there where I kind of lose my way. There's going to be dead areas that may not really impact people. So the editing allows you to see 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 people, whether it's a 10-second share or a minute share, respond to the specific question. So it keeps momentum, it keeps the pace, it gives variety, but it's all heartfelt. So.
Great. Well, and for those of you who don't have professional video recording equipment, the iPhone or Droids do this really well. If you've got an iPhone, iMovie is an exceptional editing tool, and it's free. And it might not necessarily be as polished, but it will certainly help you produce something transformational. So I would encourage you all to dabble and experiment in that regard. We just have a thank you, Joe. Jonathan says it gave Jonathan several thoughts about how to reach out in new ways for this year's stewardship campaign. So that was just
good. Thank you.
An affirmation for you.
Thanks for the comment.
Friends, we're grateful for your time. From here, we're going to sign off because this is the close of our webinar. If you have any questions or would like to be in touch with Joe, his contact information is going to be a few slides after he shares this great quote from our friend Henry Nouwen.
Thank you. So in closing, I don't think you can do an ECF webinar or presentation or workshop without closing Henry Nouwen. I think it's in our contract that we have to sign. So it's living a spiritual life requires a change of heart. Whether we are asking for money or giving money, we are drawn together by God, who is about to do a new thing through our collaboration, the reference to Isaiah. To be converted means to experience a deep shift in how we see and think and act. So I want to thank everyone for their time and contributions today, for at least joining us. And there is some additional reading if you download this. There is some contact information, and if you like Melissa, I will put my contact information on here. This is just generic ECF contact information.
Great.
Okay.
Let's get your contact information on there, Joe.
All right, great. We'll do that.
All right.
So, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Blessings and cheers to you.
Peace.